Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II shared a remarkable bond that lasted more than 70 years. Throughout their marriage, they were seen as a symbol of strength, loyalty, and enduring love. However, after decades together, Prince Philip made a decision that shocked the public. He chose not to spend his final years living with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. The move sparked countless questions and rumors. Was something wrong in the marriage? Is this a personal choice? Or was there something deeper behind it? For a long time, no one had clear answers. Now that mystery has finally begun to unravel. Princess Anne, the Queen, and Prince Philip's only daughter, has shared the real reason behind her father's decision. Her brothers, King Charles III and Prince Andrew, have backed her account, confirming what really led their father to step away from life at the palace in his final years. Princess Anne, it's often described as her father's favorite, had a uniquely close relationship with Prince Philip. The two were famously alike: strong-willed, sharp-tongued, stubborn, and not easily impressed. They were known for their blunt honesty and dry humor, often at the expense of others. Yet beneath that tough exterior was a deep mutual respect and affection. They had a bond rarely seen in royal circles, one built on trust, loyalty, and a shared worldview. Because of this closeness, Prince Philip opened up to Anne in a way he didn't with others, confiding in her about some of the personal struggles he faced in his role as consort and in his marriage. While Charles and Andrew were frequently tied up with royal duties and public engagements, Anne was often more grounded and observant of family dynamics. She saw the cracks behind the carefully maintained image of the Queen and Prince Philip's marriage. She understood that, while they loved each other, the roles they were expected to play came with immense pressure. Behind the perfect smiles and royal appearances was a more complex relationship, one shaped by duty, sacrifice, and personal differences. To truly understand what drove Prince Philip's decision, it helps to go back to the beginning of their relationship. Elizabeth and Philip first met in 1934 at a royal wedding. At the time, Elizabeth was only 8 years old, and Philip was 13. Nothing significant came of it then, but 5 years later, they met again. Elizabeth was 13, and Philip was 18. This second meeting took place during a royal visit to the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, where Philip was training as a naval cadet. Elizabeth, accompanied by her parents and sister, met Philip again. This time, something clicked from that moment. A slow but steady romance began to unfold, leading eventually to marriage and decades of shared public life. Yet, despite the love they shared, the pressures of royal life and their distinct personalities made some parts of their marriage more complicated than they appeared to the public. Prince Philip, a man who valued independence and simplicity, eventually found the highly structured ceremonial life at Buckingham Palace increasingly stifling. In his later years, he sought peace and autonomous, something that royal life could no longer give him. Princess Anne's recent revelations have offered the world a more human, honest picture of the man behind the royal title. Prince Philip didn't leave the Queen out of bitterness or conflict, but because, after a lifetime of duty, he longed for a quiet space where he could be himself, away from the constant demands of the monarchy. Due to an outbreak of NPS and chickenpox during their visit, the royal family's plans were altered. Instead of attending a chapel service as scheduled, Princess Elizabeth and her sister spent time in the headmaster's house, away from the infected students. Prince Philip, one of the few cadets who hadn't caught the illness, was asked to help entertain the young princesses. Restless and full of energy, Philip soon grew tired of staying indoors and invited the princesses outside. He began showing off playing croquet, jumping over tennis nets, and moving with a carefree, athletic spirit. His boldness and charm caught Princess Elizabeth's attention. From that moment on, she was smitten. She later admitted she never had eyes for anyone else after that day. Following their encounter, Elizabeth developed a strong teenage crush on Philip. As he served with the Royal Navy during the war, the two began exchanging letters. Elizabeth even kept a photograph of him in her room as a sign of her admiration. By 1946, Philip returned from service in the Pacific, and their relationship deepened. That June, he proposed to Elizabeth on the grounds of Balmoral Castle, and a heartfelt letter from that time, he wrote that having survived the war, seen victory, and fallen completely and unreservedly in love, made all of life's troubles seem small and insignificant. Despite the proposal, Elizabeth's father, King George VI, was hesitant. He felt she was too young and might simply be infatuated with the first man she'd met. He wondered if she might later regret her choice. Because of his concerns, the royal family kept Philip's proposal quiet. There was also resistance within the royal household. Although Philip was of royal lineage and a direct descendant of Queen Victoria, making him and Elizabeth's third cousins, many considered him too blunt, too foreign, too German, too Greek, and not quite English enough to marry the future queen. But Elizabeth was resolute. She had made up her mind and refused to consider anyone else. Eventually, after her 21st birthday, a formal engagement announcement was made in July 1947. In preparation for his marriage, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles and became a member of the Church of England, despite having been baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church. On October 3, 1947, he was formally received into the Anglican faith by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He also adopted the anglicized surname Mountbatten. On November 20, 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Philip in Westminster Abbey. They honeymooned in Hampshire at the home of Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten. At the time, neither of them knew just how dramatically their lives were about to change. After the wedding, Philip resumed his naval career, rapidly rising through the ranks. Within a year, the couple welcomed their first child, Prince Charles, followed by Princess Anne. Was eventually posted to Malta, where Elizabeth joined him while their children remained in England. For a brief period, they enjoyed a relatively normal life, one filled with freedom and privacy. This would not last. In 1952, King George VI fell ill and passed away. Elizabeth was just 25 when she became queen. Philip at 30 had to come to terms with a life he had not fully anticipated. They had hoped for more time to live freely before the heavy responsibilities of the crown took over. But fate had other plans. Elizabeth was now queen, and Philip, though her husband, was not king. His role would forever be secondary, a consort, living in the shadow of the monarch. Though this dynamic had always been understood, its emotional weight began to take a toll. Philip had to abandon his promising naval career and any ambitions he had for personal achievement. For a man accustomed to command, the sudden shift to a supporting role was difficult to bear, and this was the 1950s. Time when the idea of a husband being outranked by his wife was virtually unheard of, let alone in such a public and permanent way. To add to that, the Queen's duty to her country always came first, before family or marriage. It was a harsh reality that reshaped their relationship and defined Philip's role for the rest of his life. This marked the beginning of a lifelong internal struggle for Philip, a struggle that would later play a role in his decision to live apart from the Queen in his final years. But how exactly did that come to be? Keep reading. Elizabeth and Philip were on a safari trip in Kenya when news of King George VI's death reached them. It was Philip who broke the news to his wife. Knowing her life and his would change forever, Elizabeth understood what was expected of her. They immediately returned to the UK, where she was formally declared Queen Elizabeth II. Philip, however, was not granted the title of king consort. Instead, he became the royal consort, a role that, despite its prestige, came without much definition or recognition. Still, Prince Philip stood by his wife with unwavering loyalty. He gave up his promising naval career to fully support the monarchy. This was only the beginning of many sacrifices to come. One of the first major changes was their move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace. On June 2, 1953, over a year after Elizabeth ascended the throne, her coronation was held at Westminster Abbey. After the Archbishop of Canterbury, Philip was the first to kneel before the new monarch, pledging to be her liege man of life and limb. But for Philip, that vow came with deep personal challenges. It was not easy for a man, especially in the early 1950s, to live publicly under the authority of his wife. His naval career was over, His identity had to be redefined. He was no longer the head of his household, and he even had to walk a few steps behind Elizabeth in public. In later years, Philip would admit that he had once imagined a long future in the Navy, but quickly realized that those hopes had to be set aside. Despite accepting this new reality, tensions arose between Philip and Elizabeth early in her reign. One of their first major disagreements centered around the family name. Philip's uncle, Lord Louis Dickey Mountbatten, prematurely declared that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in Britain. The implication was that, since Elizabeth had married Philip, their children would bear his surname. But this did not sit well with Queen Mary, Elizabeth's grandmother, or Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They were adamant that the royal family remain under the House of Windsor, continuing King George VI's legacy. Philip was deeply hurt by this. He famously expressed his frustration by saying he was nothing but a bloody amoeba. The only man in Britain who wasn't allowed to pass his name to his own children. His remark revealed more than just frustration. It was a glimpse into the internal struggle he faced trying to find his place within a system where tradition and hierarchy often came before personal identity. Eventually, Elizabeth heard her husband's words and made a historic compromise. In February 1960, she declared that her descendants would use the surname Mountbatten-Windsor, a blend of both family names. It was a small but meaningful gesture that acknowledged Philip's lineage and eased some of the tension surrounding his role, still being the royal consort, came with little definition. Philip once told journalist Giles Brandreth that, for all the public attention, was often perceived as a refugee husband. Despite doing everything he could to make the best of his position, he struggled to carve out a meaningful space for himself in an institution where everything revolved around his wife. There were no clear rules for how a royal consort should act, and when he asked others what was expected of him, no one had an answer. It just looked blank, he said. What was clear to Philip, though, was his primary duty, to support Elizabeth. He may not have been the king, but he could be her strength. This responsibility often clashed with his energetic, outspoken nature traits he passed down to his daughter, Princess Anne. Still, he fulfilled his role with steadfast dedication. In the early years of Elizabeth's reign, Philip focused much of his energy on modernizing the monarchy. He feared it might become a museum piece, outdated and irrelevant. But his efforts to adapt the institution to a changing world were met with resistance. And the road ahead was anything but easy. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? Prince Philip often found himself at odds with the traditionalists in the royal household, those determined to maintain the rigid customs of the past. But rather than back down, he pushed forward with his modern ideas, many of which ultimately proved to be highly successful. One of his most significant proposals was to televise Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. At the time, this was considered a radical idea, as many within the royal establishment believed such a sacred ceremony should remain private. But Philip argued that treating the coronation like a theatrical performance hidden from public view was outdated. His instincts were correct. More than 20 million people across Britain tuned in to watch the event live. For the first time, the monarchy became more visible, more real to the public. Philip himself became the first member of the royal family to participate in a television interview. Years later, he helped open the palace doors even further by allowing a documentary film crew to capture life behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace. Though controversial, the documentary offered the public an unprecedented look into royal family life. He also urged Queen Elizabeth to end the archaic tradition of presenting debutantes at court, introducing instead more inclusive events like informal lunches and garden parties. His goal was clear: to make the monarchy feel less distant and more connected to ordinary people. He reorganized and modernized the royal estates and tried to cut through the excessive formality that weighed down the royal household. With fewer official duties than the Queen, Philip had more time to explore his own interests. He became a prolific writer, publishing 9 books by the 1980s on subjects ranging from the environment to religion. He was also deeply interested in technology, encouraging Elizabeth to deliver her annual Christmas speech on television for the first time in 1957. He even taught her to use a teleprompter. Philip himself was the first royal to use a computer and often typed his own emails and speeches. He was, in many ways, far ahead of his time. Elizabeth, for her part, did her best to include him in public life. Her frequent use of the phrase, "my husband and I," became a well-known national quip. But Philip was far more than a ceremonial figure. Despite the constraints of his position, remained a powerful force beside the Queen. In family matters, Elizabeth allowed him to take the lead. In matters of state, however, he had no real influence. Still, their relationship reflected a deep and often playful dynamic. There were moments, even in public, when Philip treated Elizabeth like any other wife. On one occasion, while driving her to Cowdray Park, his fast driving caused her to gasp sharply. Irritated, he snapped that if she did it again, he'd leave her on the side of the road. The Queen, composed as always, didn't respond, but she also wasn't afraid to assert her authority when needed. At times, she would tell him to shut up in front of staff if he overstepped, prompting him to leave the room in frustration. Like any couple, they had their ups and downs, but their bond endured. One of the more persistent challenges in their marriage was the cloud of infidelity rumors that followed Philip for decades. His natural charm and flirtatious nature often placed him at the center of speculation. His involvement in all-male gatherings like gentlemen's lunch clubs and long trips aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia in the 1950s only fueled the gossip. Over the years, he was linked often without evidence to several women, including a Russian ballerina, a British stage actress, and a writer. None of these alleged affairs were ever confirmed. At one point, the Baltimore Sun ran a story alleging Philip had been seeing a woman regularly at a West End apartment. The palace firmly denied the claim, dismissing the idea of a rift between him and the Queen. Philip himself addressed the rumors with characteristic sarcasm, once asking whether anyone had ever seen him go anywhere without a police escort. Point was simple: if he had been unfaithful, someone would have caught him. Still, royal biographer Sarah Bradford offered a different perspective. In her biography of Elizabeth, she claimed that Philip may have had an affair in the mid-1950s, but had since become far more discreet, limiting social flirtations to elite circles where privacy was easier to maintain. But again, no confirmed evidence ever emerged. What was consistently clear, however, was Philip's devotion to Elizabeth. During their golden wedding anniversary in 1997, Queen Elizabeth referred to Philip as her strength and stay throughout the years, a rare and heartfelt public expression of affection. That evening, they attended a banquet hosted by London's Lord Mayor, marking not just 50 years of marriage but also a lifetime of shared duty, sacrifice, and mutual respect. Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth shared the milestones of both their diamond and platinum anniversaries, with the Queen often expressing heartfelt gratitude for her husband's unwavering support and love over the decades. But in 2017, a significant shift occurred in their relationship, one that surprised many. After more than 70 years of marriage, the royal couple quietly made the decision to live apart. What led to this unexpected choice? In May 2017, Prince Philip announced his retirement from public life. After 7 decades of serving the crown, his decision marked the end of an era. Although the official retirement took effect on August 2, 2017, following his final royal engagement with the Royal Marines at the age of 96, it was clear that this was more than just a professional farewell. Buckingham Palace released a statement noting that the Duke of Edinburgh would no longer undertake public duties, although he might still attend certain events alongside the Queen. In reality, however, joint appearances became increasingly rare. Following his retirement, Prince Philip left Buckingham Palace and moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham Strata, modest and private residence, far from the public eye. Interestingly, this house once belonged to Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, who lived there in quiet seclusion due to his epilepsy before passing away at just 13 years old in 1919. But why did Philip choose to spend his final years there? In a 2011 interview, the 90-year-old Philip hinted at his desire for independence. He said he simply wanted to enjoy himself. Though he didn't step back from royal duties until 5 years later, that wish lingered. His retirement and move to Sandringham had the full support of the Queen, who understood that after decades of service, her husband deserved time to live on his own terms. However, when Philip first arrived at Wood Farm, he was taken aback to find a full royal staff, including cooks and telephone operators already stationed there, prepared to maintain the usual royal standards. He had hoped for a simpler, quieter life. Still, he adapted quickly and made the most of his time in seclusion, and Sandringham's calm and privacy. Philip rediscovered old passions and embraced new hobbies. No longer able to play polo due to arthritis in his wrists, he turned to carriage, driving a sport that brought him both joy and relaxation, though he eventually had to give it up as his strength declined. He also found peace in painting watercolors, reading especially history books, and engaging in thoughtful discussions. With close friends, Philip also loved to drive, often navigating the country roads around the estate. However, in January 2019, he was involved in a car accident after pulling onto a main road near Sandringham. His SUV flipped, but remarkably, Philip walked away without serious injury. The other vehicle's driver and passenger, however, sustained minor injuries, leading to public concern about whether he should continue driving at his age. The passengers in the other vehicle were injured, and Prince Philip issued a personal apology. 3 weeks after the incident, he voluntarily surrendered his driver's license. At 97 years old, Buckingham Palace confirmed that the Duke of Edinburgh would no longer be driving on public roads. However, he was still permitted to drive on private estates, and he was seen behind the wheel at Windsor Castle as late as April 2019. What was initially intended to be a short retreat at Wood Farm quietly turned into a permanent move. Philip chose not to return to Buckingham Palace, aware that even in retirement, his presence there would likely draw him back into royal duties. Instead, he fully embraced the quiet and simplicity of life at Wood Farm Cottage, away from the formalities of palace life. This arrangement meant that he and Queen Elizabeth would spend long stretches apart, yet their bond remained strong. They spoke daily on the phone, sharing updates about their days, and the Queen, along with other family members, would make visits to Wood Farm to spend time with him. Despite stepping away from public life, Philip made appearances at significant family events. He attended the 2018 royal weddings of Prince Harry, Princess Eugenie, Lady Gabriella Windsor, and Princess Beatrice. However, with time, Philip began to feel the weight of his long life. He endured the loss of close friends within a single year. 3 longtime companions passed away, including his personal valet of 40 years. The gradual disappearance of those who had been a constant presence was a heavy emotional burden. Even so, Prince Philip remained remarkably fit and active for his age. While his short-term memory began to decline as he approached 100, he retained a sharp wit and physical agility that surprised many. But he wasn't particularly excited about reaching the century mark. Known for disliking fuss, he made it clear he preferred to keep celebrations minimal. In his final years, he continued to travel between residences. During Easter, he was typically at Windsor, and on some weekends, he visited Broadlands with Queen Elizabeth. However, he began to visit Balmoral less frequently, cutting short his stays in both 2019 and 2020 before returning to the solitude of Wood Farm. In early 2020, the Queen briefly joined him in Sandringham, and Prince Charles came to visit as well, an emotional moment that symbolized a quiet role reversal between father and son. Still, these reunions were brief, as the Queen often needed to return to London to fulfill state duties. Then came something unexpected, something that brought Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip back together under the same roof. In March 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic took hold and national lockdowns were enforced, Prince Philip joined the Queen at Windsor Castle. Together, they entered what was affectionately dubbed HMS Bubble, a reference to the protective measures that surrounded them during lockdown. Cut off from the outside world, they stayed in touch with family via Zoom calls, adapting to the digital age in their own quiet way. On July 22, 2020, Philip made his final official public appearance. He stepped into the quadrangle at Windsor Castle, to hand over his role as Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles to the Duchess of Cornwall. It was a brief but poignant moment, his last in front of the cameras. By January 2021, both he and the Queen had received their COVID-19 vaccinations, administered by a household doctor at Windsor Castle, as the world continued to grapple with the pandemic. In February 2021, Prince Philip was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital as a precaution after feeling unwell. Though he arrived unaided, news of his hospitalization sparked widespread concern. Buckingham Palace later confirmed that he was being treated for an infection, and following that, successfully underwent a heart procedure. He was discharged soon after, returning home to Windsor Castle. As his 100th birthday approached, public interest grew, with many hoping to celebrate this remarkable milestone with him. But Philip, ever modest and pragmatic, wasn't enthusiastic about the idea. Perhaps he sensed the end was near. Just 3 weeks later, on the morning of April 9, 2021, Prince Philip passed away peacefully at the age of 99, with Queen Elizabeth by his side. The palace described his death as quiet and dignified, and the Queen later admitted that his absence had left a huge void in her life. A week later, on April 17th, his funeral was held at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. He was temporarily laid to rest in the royal vault alongside 25 other coffins, including that of King George III. Notably, his will was not made public. In a rare legal move, it was sealed for 90 years to protect the Queen's dignity and the reputation of the monarchy, fueling speculation that its contents might include sensitive personal details. Prince Philip's legacy resonated deeply within his family. Princess Anne described him as her teacher, supporter, and critic. She praised his ability to treat everyone as individuals and expressed her admiration for the life of service he had led, a life freely given to duty, to family, and to the crown. She said she hoped to emulate his example. Prince Charles paid tribute to his father's unwavering dedication, noting the extraordinary energy and support Philip had provided to Queen Elizabeth and to the Commonwealth for more than 7 decades. Prince Andrew also spoke about his father's deep devotion to family, recalling treasured moments from their time together. About a year after Philip's death, Queen Elizabeth reflected on their bond during a speech about Scotland, a place she and Philip cherished. "I have spoken before of my deep and abiding affection for this wonderful country, and of the many happy memories Prince Philip and I always held of our time here," she said. "It is often said that it is the people that make a place, and there are few places where this is truer than in Scotland." Though Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth spent much of their later years living apart, theirs was a partnership built on deep mutual respect, devotion, and duty. His decision to move to Wood Farm wasn't a rejection of his marriage. It was a retreat into simplicity after a lifetime of public service. He had done his part, and he sought peace in his final chapter. Queen Elizabeth passed away a little over a year later, on September 8, 2022. At the age of 96, she was laid to rest beside her beloved Philip at the King George VI Memorial Chapel. In Windsor, in death as in life, they were reunited. Prince Philip's life was one of service, complexity, and quiet resilience. His choice to live separately in his final years continues to invite discussion. Was it simply for peace and privacy? Or was there more to the story? What do you think about his decision?